parents of South African founders and business and entrepreneurs, raising funding locally and internationally. And our real goal here is to highlight how the South African regulatory environment challenges that process sometimes, and to propose some policy reforms in that regard. My name is Adrian Domisa. I'm the founding partner of Domisa Attorneys, a law firm dedicated to supporting tech startups to set up, fund, and grow internationally, and hopefully exit. And I'm going to introduce our panel here today, as well, invite them to introduce themselves. Firstly, Matsi Modise, chairperson of the South African Startup Movement. Matsi, would you like to give some background about yourself?
Yes, so I'm Matsi Modise. I wear a lot of hats, one of which I am a startup myself. I have a company called Furaha Africa Holdings. We focus on technology training and also skills technology. And I'm also an entrepreneurship activist. We've been engaging the government for many, many years around policy reform. So hence I am part of Simodisa, which is a nonprofit that focuses on policy reform. And then we also have the South African Startup Act movement, which is the reason why we're here today and the reason why we've been able to engage the government around constructive policy reform. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wonderful. Thanks, Matsi. And thanks for being such a champion of South African entrepreneurs. Then I'd like to introduce Stefan. Stefan Lamprecht will be presenting the case studies today. He's from VS Nova. Stefan, some background from yourself.
Hi, good everyone. Good day, everyone. My name is Stefan, as mentioned, and firstly, thank you very much for the opportunity. Also nice to see the rest of the panelists, and it's been a journey. Also, thanks, Brian, a lot for the support and the patience. I'm an industrial engineer by training, but my focus is very much around strategy and research and policy in the startup space. So I do a lot of research related to both on the policy side, supply and demand side, but also from an early stage investment point of view in terms of the transactional activity in the early stage space, venture capital, angel investment, etc. Thanks a lot, everyone. I'm looking forward to share the results.
Thank you. Looking forward to that, Stefan. And then I'd like to ask Brian Yala to introduce himself. He's Capital Markets Manager from FSD Africa in Kenya.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you all the panelists. Yeah, so like Adrian has said, I'm Brian Yala, working as a manager within the capital markets team at FSD Africa, basically charged with managing some of our initiatives across the continent. And FSD Africa, we are a specialist development agency, and we support market development initiatives within the financial sector in a way that ensures that finance will work for Africa's future. So we partnered with the Simodisa and the Startup Initiative sometime last year under the ambit of what we call the Africa Private Capital Markets Program, which basically aims to support regulatory policy and legal kind of reforms within the private capital markets, of course, including the venture capital space, which is much more relevant to startups, as well as capacity building, research, etc., and also to support transactions in a way that develops those markets. So that is just a background on the genesis of the partnership. As I'm sure all the panelists are, I'm looking forward to the discussions in this session and the follow-up conversations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian. Looking forward to your perspectives in our discussion. Then I'd like to introduce Sabiri Murray from University of Cape Town, where he's Innovation Commercialization Manager.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for the invitation to be part of this panel and part of the process as well. So I work for Research Contracts and Innovation, which is effectively a support division or department of the university, working across the university to assist early stage startups, inventors, and entrepreneurs to effectively grow and commercialize the technologies that gets developed from the university space. The perspective that I effectively bring towards this is, very much from the deep tech innovation startup space from universities, as well as other SMEs also, trying to raise capital in the early stage as well. We know that it can be challenging effectively for any startup to develop and set up the company, raise funding, but it's especially challenging from a deep tech space also because of the kind of impact, large scale impact that a lot of the companies intend to make. So really looking forward to the discussion and the discussion around the case studies that we're effectively launching today. Thank you.
Thanks, Siberi, and thanks for representing the best university in South Africa, and I'm not biased. And then finally, Blanca Ribos-Pombo, I'd like you to please introduce yourself and the role you play at Plug and Play Venture Capital.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I work for Plug and Play, which is a global venture capital firm headquartered in Silicon Valley, and I work in the African investments team. We invest in Africa globally, and then we have presence in 3 countries, which are Morocco, Egypt, and South Africa, where we also run open innovation programs for corporates and accelerator programs.
Wonderful, thank you. And with that, I'd like to set just the tone of the anticipated outcomes for today. So firstly, we're going to focus on sharing or share the methodology and the way we engaged with the various founders to draw out the results of the key report findings. Now, remember, the goal of this case study today is to look into those founders' experiences, entrepreneurs' experience, to see how that makes an argument for policy reform in South Africa. One of the primary areas of that policy reform will be to see how we can address exchange control as a limiting factor to those founders' goals and missions. Then we're going to see understand the state of early stage investment landscape and how we can increase access of funding for early stage startups, particularly international investors. We have a specific goal of understanding how we can address the difficulties of obtaining startup visas to attract international skills to South Africa. And then finally, whether we can improve access to startup growth through addressing preferential procurement limitations. But just to quickly introduce where we come from and why this is relevant to us, I'd like to ask Matsi to please just introduce the South African Startup Act movement.
Thank you so much, Adrian. So as indicated, I am a startup myself. I have the intentions of growing my business beyond the borders of South Africa, because we are living in that world where today as South Africans, we are able to come up with products and services that are able to scale and attract a global market and also global investors. So what happened in about 2016, 2017, Tunisia was a pioneer in coming up with a Startup Act because they were looking for avenues in which they can grow the economy and they can also harness, a startup culture, but taking advantage of where they are geographically. They're literally at the tip of the north of Africa, but then they have a very geographical advantage with Europe, which tends to be a big market. So they then came up with a startup, and Tunisia was the first African country to come up with a Startup Act. And over the years, and in the most recent weeks, we've been hearing about mergers and acquisitions of some of the Tunisian startups. But this is because a country like Tunisia had the political will to encourage startups to really grow. They have 3 pillars, which is having a policy framework, having capacity that's going to help grow the startups, but then also investing in these startups. So in 2020, South Africa realized that there is this movement called the Startup Act that's starting in Tunisia, countries like Senegal, countries like Kenya, countries like Congo, Nigeria. They're all coming up with policy frameworks in which it helps and guides the government how to support, nurture, and enable startups that are high growth and high impact. And also it's important that we identify what a startup means, because I can wake up and have an idea and then tomorrow I start a business. That's not necessarily the startups that we were talking to. These are highly innovative companies, not older than 5 years in age, generating less than 100 million rands in turnover. They invest a lot in research and development to create intellectual property, and their aims are to scale beyond the borders of the country and hopefully one day list or sell at very high multiples. So those are that's how we define the startups that we're talking about. And then in 2020, as South Africa, as the startup ecosystem, we came together and said, well, South Africa has a great advantage. We do have a lot of the policies in place, but it's a function of how do we actually identify policies that must be refined. Policies around business visas. Last year, the president mentioned that South Africa, for the first time, will have a startup visa or a visa for remote workers, right? And that is because of the work that the startup movement has been doing and various other suggestions around ensuring that we create an enabling policy environment for our South African startups to thrive. So I think I'll leave it at that, Adrian, and I'll unpack further as to what these recommendations were and also how they link up with the case studies that we're going to hear about today.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Matsi. All right, next up is the case study itself in the presentation. Stefan, can I hand that over to you?
Thanks very much, Adrian. Kingsley, I just want to check, are you able to put the presentation on for me?
Sure, Stefan, I'm just putting it on now.
Okay, no worry. While you're busy, I'll start with the introduction so long. Yeah, so thank you very much. This has been quite a process, and it's been quite an honor to be part of this process. I think through this, we've had the opportunity to really engage with a lot of very interesting companies and individuals. Yeah, and I'm quite happy to share some of the insights from that. So going to the next page there on the purpose. So the purpose of the research was very much in the backdrop to the Startup Act and the Startup Act position paper that was released more or less a year and a half ago. And one of the key challenges with the Startup Act is that, importantly, yeah, we are not preaching to ourselves. So if it was up to the entrepreneurs and the investors, then it's very clear what needs to be done. The important part here is that the regulatory environment and the policymakers need to buy into what are the merits and what is the case for having the Startup Act. And that's where the case studies were conceptualized as a way to really articulate the real voices of the stakeholders in the SA startup ecosystem so that we can understand what their experiences are specifically to regulatory inhibitors and red tape. One of the fundamental points of departure for the Startup Act is not to introduce additional regulations or to introduce more laws, but really to go and say that in contrast to Tunisia or those other African countries where there isn't a regulatory support system that speak to startups, in South Africa, we've got a very, very good regulatory support environment. But the challenge here for our startups is to a large extent that because of competing regulations and competing systems within government, that it makes it virtually impossible for startups to succeed based on the efficiency of trying to bring new products to the market, especially when going global. So a premise of the Startup Act is really to try and relax some of the regulations to make it easier for startups, and especially high growth startups, to succeed in South Africa and in the global economy. So to really understand that and to explain that, the case studies tried to really engage with individuals, and those individuals are both on the supply and the demand side. So it's not just about the experiences of founders, but it's also about the experiences of accelerators, of investors, and of those that support and service the startup ecosystem in terms of really playing a more significant role in the economy. We try to identify and then specifically explain the experienced impact. So this is not about our, as the research point of view, perception of what the situation is, but it is really about what are the experiences on the ground for people that have firsthand experienced the challenges of dealing with red tape. And then importantly, out of this research, to try and contextualize this within the provisions that are in the South African Startup Act. So there are a number of relaxations, and the way that the whole startup case studies report was structured is really then to contextualize that and reflect back to the relaxations proposed in the Startup Act position paper. Okay, next slide. So importantly, we started off with the process. The Startup Act Movement Steering Committee, comprised of a number of the key initiative stakeholders like Simodisa, Endeavour, SAFCA, etc. I'm not going to name all of them, but they are all very much involved and very much championing the cause. And the point of departure was for them to propose a number of candidates that, from their experience, have been subjected to a number of these challenges that we targeted through the position paper. These candidates in the initial part of the research were contacted, and then we drew up an evaluation scheme whereby we tried to understand for each candidate how relevant it is in terms of their relevance to the South African economy, meaning their experience. Was it something that is a once-off experience, or is this something that is experienced on a regular basis? Also in terms of their growth trajectories and their positioning in the South African economy. And all of that enabled us to come up with a grouping of candidates that were then featured in these case studies. As in the process, we had to identify additional candidates because as we went along and we understood the journey a little bit better, some of the candidates also mentioned some of their peers and some of their compatriots that experienced the same, or that it even more relevant experiences that we could include in the startup case study report. These interviews were conducted over a period of time during the latter part of last year, and then also supplemented with a very short survey that went out to quite a number of entrepreneurs and founders that at that stage already set up companies overseas as a result of some of the experiences and the constraints experienced in the South African economy. So some of those insights were also then integrated into the report. So out of that, we came up with 11 case studies. If you look on the left-hand side of the column there, you'll see the Startup Act relaxation, the 4 main relaxations, and then each of the case studies more or less as they relate to some of those relaxations. It's important to note that the business of business involves everything, not just one specific area. So most of those relaxations were relevant to each of these case studies, but we still try to emphasize specific experiences that each of the case studies had that we could draw back to each of those relaxations, just to make the case a little bit clearer. So the first one there, one of the relaxations in the Startup Act provide incentives to encourage investment in qualifying startups. And the 2 case studies that speak specifically to that, the first one is put the baby back in the bathwater, which talks about the whole Section 12J experience and how that's left us literally with no incentives to incentivize high net worth individuals to get back into the early stage entrepreneurial game. And the second one is the world is an investor's oyster, which basically just outlines the fact that from an investor's point of view, even a South African investor, they are not limited to investing in South African opportunities. The opportunities are truly global. So the regulatory environment puts the South African startups and the ones looking for investment at a disadvantage. But from an investor's point of view, the world is really their oyster. The second one, to relaxation focusing on ensuring access to talent. Case studies there speaking firstly, the Golden Goose Shaft offshore, which talks about the experiences of fintech and our growing fintech cluster, and how a lot of entrepreneurs and the accelerators that support those entrepreneurs are setting up international operations based on the challenges faced in South Africa. And there today I saw in the news that RMB has opened up a New York office, which very much speaks to this specific case study. The second one there is South Africa really open for business. So we talk about it, we have it on our investment campaigns, we make a lot of noise about it. But when you speak to international founders that are operating in South Africa, the answer is not necessarily that clear. And then the third one is that it's not always about the red tape. And that just says that even though we've got red tape, sometimes startups have no choice other than try and locate and market where their customer is. And if that happens and we don't have the right incentives in place, it means that none of the benefits, the job creation, the investment, and the ultimate value creation, that reverts back to South Africa. Then the third one there, remove barriers to entry. Firstly, going global requires global investors. That's the very first case study in the report, and that outlines the experiences that's very specific to that opportunity of looking for international capital. And that sets the scene for a lot of the constructs that we've used in the research. The second one, Journey Without a Destination, talks about the experiences of entrepreneurs and how they, that are the experts in their products and services, have to put that on hold to become experts on navigating red tape and navigating exchange control approvals, which at the end of the day means that they are just carrying on trying to solve a puzzle that to a large extent is unsolvable. When Chickens Come Home to Roost features the case study of an entrepreneur that had an approval for exchange control many years back, and now quite a bit down the line, the ramifications of that exchange control approval is still playing out in their business. And then the last one on relaxation number 3, about playing to our strengths and saying, but in South Africa, we've got an enormous opportunity. And that's echoed in all the interviews in terms of a real access to market, but talented entrepreneurs, we've got investors, but are we really playing to our strengths? And then the fourth relaxation, exemption from preferential procurement limitations. And by all means, this is not an anti-BEE tirade, not at all. All it comes down to is saying that our startups in South Africa, black and white, are not able to compete from preferential procurement on the same level as the multinationals. And that's where, number one, we want the case study that talks about the need for level playing grounds, and saying that if we truly want to reinvigorate our economy and create new opportunities, we need to allow those startups and those entrepreneurs that are at the pinnacle of coming up with new innovations to really get those things into the market. And then the second one there, sometimes it's best to stay small, which just means that a lot of founders, in order to stay away from all the regulations that go with being a large company in South Africa, they choose to rather just stay small. So these individual case studies can be read together or as a whole, and therefore you will find there could be some repetition of just explaining what we mean with exchange control, or the impact of intellectual property and shifting that offshore. But it can be handled as quite a big report, and that's why we put a extensive executive summary in there as well, to make it more consumable. It includes anonymous quotes from the interviews that people have made, as well as quotes that came from text. Okay, so some notable insights, and I'm going to run along here. Now I'm running a little bit short on time. The candidates participated on condition of anonymity, both from a founder's point of view. A lot of these people are still seeking exchange control approval and didn't want to hamper that process by going in the record and mentioning some of their experiences which could be perceived to be critical to the authorities. Some of the service providers are very much, and the investors are very much on an arm's length basis engaging with Treasury and with Reserve Bank, and also didn't want to jeopardize those relationships. So all the case studies were done anonymously. Secondly, the biggest impact very much of the red tape is placing a glass ceiling on the ability to go global. So yes, there's a lot of things that constrain them in terms of red tape. All of these startups, in one way or another, have been able to make a plan, okay? But the impediment here is that when we want to go global and really succeed and get those South African unions so that our economy can grow. It's both South African and foreign founders that were interviewed that want to live and do business in South Africa. The opportunity is there. The SA startup ecosystem is already a major contributor to jobs and tax revenues, and it's a growing contributor. But for us to really play a larger role, and for this important ecosystem to really improve the South African situation in terms of our economy and our social realities, we have to solve exchange controls. And this can be done, yes, through the introduction of a complete act, but a lot of these are low-hanging fruits that could be addressed through direct interventions. Kingsley, the last one there. Kingsley, just the last slide.
Stefan, we can see a slide with main findings.
Can you see the main findings?
Yes.
Oh, okay. It's not showing on my side. Okay, but you're seeing main findings. Okay, so the biggest impact of the red tape in South Africa is the laws that constrain the ability for South African entrepreneurs to attract and retain foreign capital, and at the same time remain South African. So yes, we have the stories of the entrepreneurs that have gotten huge investments, but they didn't do that based with the address in Cape Town or in Johannesburg. They had to relinquish that and domicile themselves overseas. Most candidates on the supply and the demand side are or have been impacted by the limitations of exchange controls. And when we talk about those limitations, as outlined in the report, it's basically on 4 main levels. The first one, attracting foreign capital as a South African domiciled startup. Secondly, transacting globally from South Africa, meaning making disbursements, which is very difficult, costly, and time-yes. Extracting and realizing equity growth and value. And then lastly, the issue of creating certainty. If we want to attract and retain not just capital, but also talent. So the question here is not a question of can South African startups be successful? There are many of them that are, and there are many success stories about. The question rather here is, how can the vibrant ecosystem play a bigger role in the South African economy and the society as a whole? And that can really be done only if we address the findings that are in the report, and then specifically the relaxations that are in the Startup Act. So that's it from our side. I look forward to the discussion. Over to you, Adrian.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stefan, for that summary. Really appreciate it, very insightful. I'd like to put a question then to the broader panel of general impressions of Stefan's presentation. What are the biggest challenges hindering the growth and success of startups in South Africa? I think Stefan's gone through a few of them, so I'd really like to draw out ones that are relevant to yourselves and perhaps your perspectives of them and insights into those possible hindrances.
Adrian, I think I'll give it a go, and I'm sure my other colleagues will join me. But I just, one of the things that I've been able to figure out is the fact that policy reform requires those who are requiring it and those who can effect it. So those who require it are the high impact, high growth startups wanting to build and scale their businesses. And the ones that can affect it and change it and make it easier for the startups to really build their businesses, grow their businesses is the government. So there's a huge disconnect. There's a huge disconnect between us as a startup ecosystem and the government, who are the ones that set the policies, the legislations. And until those conversations are not had collectively, where we're not engaging ourselves as an ecosystem in isolation, and the government also doesn't necessarily understand the challenges, because they are the ones that have put those policies. I mean, if you had to look at exchange control, it's one of those very archaic structures that were put in place to avoid capital flight before 1994, right? But is it still relevant today? Is South Africa one of many countries that have it? Probably not. One of the few countries that still have exchange control. So we need to start having constructive conversations with the government, the policymakers. We need to start explaining to them when we talk about the challenges that we have. Hence, a case study report like this one is very important, because this is real life experiences that are being told by real life startups that don't want to leave South Africa. They want to start, build grow their business out of South Africa so that they can contribute towards the economy, so that they can contribute towards jobs and unemployment and poverty, you know, all the three challenges. But because we are all isolated, engaging in silos, we're not coming together, it's going to be a challenge for us to be able to actually come up with solutions. So that's one of the challenges that I've been able to identify, that there is that disconnect. But luckily, with the Startup Act movement, we've gotten to a point where we've engaged ministers. So from the Department of Science and Innovation, from this Department of Small Business Development, recently with the Deputy Finance Minister. And then also we spoke to a DDG in Home Affairs in terms of the startup visa. So this that we're doing is coming to a point where now we're bringing the government to the table.
Thank you, Matsi. I appreciate that. And actually a comment as you were speaking came in saying it must be hard for the policymakers to change policy if they've never been entrepreneurs. And a study like this will surely show probably the real life experience, hopefully convincing them of the real life experience and the challenges that they face. Brian, I think perhaps you've got a perspective too.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Matsi. I just wanted to speak about financing to the startups, which is also one of the challenges. So my thoughts is that we need to basically innovate more to determine how we can increase the financing that will go to the startups. And of course, Stefan talked about the 12J. Based on a retrospective analysis, it's actually been determined that it was actually bearing some sort of fruits. You could see some increased flow into the startup kind of space. But we also need to see how we can basically build up more, not necessarily from a policy perspective, but of course the policy side is important. But we need to see how we can encourage even local institutional investors to participate in this kind of markets through innovative kind of transactions or structures that will basically recalibrate some of the risk profiles for the startups that would then encourage the flow of both actually domestic institutional capital and international capital flows. Of course, the exchange control issue is important. There are other learnings from the other kind of startup conversations that have happened in other countries that maybe would allow having a foreign currency kind of accounts or similar arrangements that will facilitate internationalization of these startups through free flow of capital. So I'll just put those initial thoughts here. Of course, we'll share details as we go along.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate that. Any other introductory comments from the panel before I go into our questions and specific discussions?
Yeah, so yeah, I just wanted to mention that I completely agree, and I thought the presentation was really interesting, and that these are really real issues that should be addressed in the country. And fundamentally in South Africa, there's actually a big shortage of risk capital to invest in startups. And South Africa, with a large base of high net worth individuals and globally recognized capital markets, should not have a lack of early stage capital, which is necessary to empower its own startup ecosystem. And also the complexity and uncertainty presented by startups in having to comply with South African regulations, such as exchange controls and IP assignments to offshore entities, as you all mentioned, right? So all in all, the combination of limitations does not help South African founders to compete on level terms for local and international capital. So that's my point of view on this.
Thank you. It's very consistent with some of our experiences. I really appreciate the international perspective, echoing those concerns in particular. If there are no other comments, I'll go into some of our discussion questions. First one is for Matsi. And Stefan indicated this. He said he observed that the country repeatedly says that we're open for business. And open for business in my mind means available to attract investment for growth and profitable economic activity on an international scale. Matsi, is that true, or do we need to do more?
Well, if you read the report, this is my first stab at encouraging people to download and actually read the report. You will see that there are more reasons why people are leaving South Africa than actually staying. I think because we're very patriotic, we would want to stay because South Africa is beautiful. There's no other place like South Africa. But sometimes when you now have to make clear business decisions, and you look at the environment, the trading environment, you look at the investment environment, you look at the red tape that you have to climb loops if you're wanting to get international investors, because South Africa, the reality is it's a small market, right? If you're wanting to grow a global business, South Africa is one of the smaller markets. But for you to expand and get that expansion capital and get access to markets, we are not making South Africa attractive for you to stay here because it's not cost efficient. It's actually more difficult. And hence we're seeing a lot of technology startups not even considering registering their intellectual property in South Africa to start off with, because they have seen enough to know that if you want to scale and scale globally, investors will ask you, where is your IP registered? And if you had to say South Africa, chances are they will not consider you, or if your business is compelling enough, they will encourage you to register in Mauritius or in Delaware or any of those other jurisdictions in Europe that are much more encouraging. And then when you also look at attraction of talent, because talent comes here to share ideas, to co-invest, to co-create these big businesses and externalize them outside of South Africa. South Africa, the business visa regime is highly unattractive. You've heard stories of high-level CEOs of global businesses. I mean, this is the cream of the crop that probably took 6 months for them to get their business visas to be able to function and work in South Africa. So we are not creating all the reasons why South Africa should actually mean it when they say we open for business. We make it very, very difficult. And a lot of countries, I think recently Spain has launched is a nomadic visa, right? Portugal, golden visas in Dubai and Mauritius, and everybody's literally coming out and saying, hey, we want you to come here. We want you to contribute towards our economy, but then also grow your business out of our country because it's adding to the growth of our country. So we have to change, right? Even if it's one of the various recommendations that we made to send a signal that please, let's just do something. Let's shift something, because a lot of the recommendations and the reforms that we are asking for, they don't require any money, right? They just require a rejigging, a refunctioning of something. The processes of registering your intellectual property, or going through the entire exchange control process where you have to get validation and approvals and everything else. I mean, those are some small little things that can be tweaked so that the system is predictable, is efficient, and it's cost efficient as well. So currently we are not open for business for technology startups. We're definitely not open for business. No.
Thanks, Matsi. I mean, I really rang true with encouraging entrepreneurs to stay and assisting those who want to come to come. The amount of tourists that you meet in the streets of Cape Town who would love to live here at any excuse and bring their skills, it's overwhelming. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Next question is for Saberi. This is an interesting one. Saberi, did you know that? Oh, you did, because I put this question to you beforehand. Nigeria recently announced that the ICT industry contributes more to its GDP than the oil industry. I mean, they must have done some remarkable things on the ground there to encourage the industry. Now, specifically in your world, what initiatives would you bring in if you were, say, Minister of Science and Innovation, to specifically encourage the ICT industry in, for example, areas that need it the most, unemployed youth and women in our economy? Thanks,
Adrian. So, my role and perspective effectively on the Startup Movement Act is typically from a university perspective, where we we at the Technology Transfer in Innovation and Entrepreneurship Support Offices at the universities. You know, our perspective is working with researchers who effectively want to address some of those key challenges, right, around health, agriculture, climate change, and that sort of thing. And, you know, while I think that in terms of like the environment and the enabling environment, there are a lot of good initiatives that I don't think a lot of people understand or know of, or, you know, can get behind effectively from, say, for example, the Department of Science and Innovation, that enables such a lot of early stage R&D, you know, translational research as well, to address some of these key challenges that makes an impact for, you know, women and the youth, and, you know, to try and address the imbalance, the socioeconomic imbalance in South Africa. So, you know, very recently, I think the DSI last year in December actually had their decadal plan for science and innovation and technology support approved by Parliament. And there are a number of initiatives there effectively that they have planned in order to support, you know, the development of solutions and innovation to support entrepreneurship and that sort of thing within those different sectors. And I think that, you know, personally, I think that there's a real need for doubling down effectively as well. And, you know, increasing, obviously, you know, there's a target in increasing the percentage of the GDP that is effectively invested into technology development, R&D, research and development, right? And you know, from my perspective, there are especially in the early stage R&D and startup space, regulatory hurdles and challenges as well that, you know, complicate things with regard to, you know, the registration of new innovations, the translation, and the cost of effectively doing the clinical trials as well. We do, but I think the biggest, well, part of the biggest challenge is effectively, you know, the education system, the role that we play in terms of like the technology transfer offices to try and assist entrepreneurs and innovators who come through our systems and processes and our pipelines to, you know, overcome the regulatory hurdles from a tech innovation regulatory hurdle, or especially in health, right? They are significant. Coming back to the case studies as well, I think a lot of the tech, well, what I appreciate about the compilation of the case studies is that it actually helps to improve the general understanding of what is required effectively for later stage startups and companies to, you know, design certain structures or to raise funding internationally and to comply. Because I think that is one of the things that that I basically took from when I read some of the case studies and interacted with Stefan, is that, you know, generally South African companies and tech startup companies do want to comply. It's just that the hurdle to do so is, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of expertise, and it's costly as well, right? So what I would do is effectively, you know, try and, you know, support the institutions that are trying to enable the translation of innovation from the university environment, and make even like the intellectual property registration from universities, you know, that much easier. The technology transfer officers play a great role when that is concerned. And also just, you know, I think, you know, there are other initiatives that the DSI have in place to support organizations like SARIMA, the Southern African Research and Innovation Management Association, NIPMO as well, who, you know, in our space are effectively ensuring that translation of solutions and innovation does happen, and we can enable, you know, spin-out and start-up companies from universities effectively to realize the impact and the intended impact that they do want to make.
Thanks, Samir. I appreciate that. And the universities of South Africa certainly are a source of some pretty remarkable innovations. We look forward to seeing that grow. And I think, taking just one of the gists of what you said, just encouraging those institutions that are responsible or can create the skills, I suppose, to promote ICT development in South Africa. Okay, Brian, the next question's for you in the context of the dreaded exchange controls. So exchange controls are regularly found to be, or alleged to be anyway, the biggest impediment for growing startups, specifically looking for international capital, because of the negative perception that investors have of a body of law that controls moving of cash in and out of the country when they are investing into it. What lessons can we learn from other Pan-African countries? I'm told that Nigeria, Kenya, and Tunisia have supported their startups. What's your experience, or what lessons do you think we can learn from them?
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So, like you've mentioned, indeed, there is, I think, increasing recognition of the importance of startups in Africa, and we are seeing various countries actually trying to implement reforms, or even basically just implement a startup kind of acts or bills. Yeah, the countries you mentioned, Nigeria, Kenya, Tunisia, I know they are at an advanced stage in terms of, or at advanced stages, or actually have already passed or implemented their respective startup acts or reforms. But in my perspective, I think one of the main lessons is that we basically need to have ecosystem-wide or end-to-end kind of reforms or provisions so that we ensure all parts are working in congruence. So you might have specific provisions or policies or regulations, like is the case in South Africa. But then when you look at the collective, you have some of them that do not work very well. So it's actually counterproductive, and it limits the potential of the startups in the country. In Nigeria, like I was saying, they passed their Startup Act most recently, I think in 2022. It was also a collaborative kind of project with the Startup Act initiative there and the federal government. And that particular act, it provides the ecosystem, or it aims to basically facilitate an ecosystem-wide support, ranging from the tax relief, the fiscal incentives, in the context of relevant laws. You have the incentives for investors as well to enable the flow of financing to the startups. You have even establishment of a fund to basically provide some early stage financing. And other provisions, credit guarantee scheme, they have outlined guidelines or some preliminary guidelines on intellectual property. And they are also recommending basically some funding kind of channels like crowdfunding. So you can see it's an ecosystem-wide kind of approach. And for Tunisia, I think it's the same thing. You have the incentives there, you have a fund, guarantees, tax kind of provisions or reliefs. The Kenya one, of course, it hasn't gone through the entire process, but it basically borrows from or some of the themes are recurrent, or you have repeating themes. So you have your funds, you have your reliefs, you have your incentives. Also trying to have an ecosystem-wide approach. So I think some of those common kind of themes, they provide some potential reference points and potential learnings for the South African government as, of course, it works towards the startup reforms. On the exchange controls, yeah, I think there is a need for a more deliberate approach of internationalizing the startups. The point I was making at the very beginning, there could be a number of solutions, but I think those need to actually be underpinned by deliberations on actually what applies in the current context, like Matthew was saying. I know, for instance, the Startup Act in Tunisia, in in the aspect of trying to internationalize the startups. They have basically a provision that would help them or will allow them hold a foreign currency kind of account to facilitate free flow of capital to and from the startups. I don't know to what extent that addresses the aspect of controls, but yeah, I think the main issue is that there's need for more intentional deliberations to identify what actually works in the specific context, and in this case, South Africa. Thank you, Adrian. Those will be my points.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. And one of my takeaways from what you said is just the way that the collective works together. So the interplay, it's not just exchange controls, it's the interplay with other areas of complex law. And in my experience, international tax is terribly complicated. And to take a body of law that's meant to apply for large multinational companies, to try and translate that to startups, it's very hard, it's not appropriate, which is another argument, by the way, for a Startup Act to allow its own discrete body of law that's simpler. But I appreciate that. Thank you, Brian. Blanca, a question to you. A common theme out of the report was that the founders expect, and it's very much expected from outside too, that international investors prefer to invest in startups who have companies domiciled in other countries, partly due to the strict regulations on IP ownership. What's your investment evaluation process? And what challenges have you come across from your perspective as an international investor into South African and other African companies?
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. So basically, I will explain a little bit how Plug and Play works, because it's a bit, I would say, weird. So at Plug and Play, we do three things. We do venture capital, corporate innovation, and we also run accelerator programs. We are headquartered in Silicon Valley, and we operate as a family office and fund manager with industry-specific funds. In South Africa, we have an office in Johannesburg, where we run accelerator programs and open innovation for corporate partners, also working with the private sector and startups. Then our investment thesis is basically we invest from pre-seed to Series A rounds, and we do follow-ons. Our average ticket size is of $150,000, and we prefer startups with a B2B or B2B2C business model with a multi-country focus. Then we don't lead rounds. We follow on and co-invest with a wide network of investors. And then we rely on our very own Plug and Play ecosystem, which includes having 3 country offices across the continent, a Plug and Play EMEA team of over 200 employees with VC experience and deep understanding of tech and innovation trends. And then also we have a solid network of local and regional investors we regularly collaborate with. And this allows us to take a more nuanced approach when conducting diligence. And due to the mentioned strict regulations, most of the startups that come across our pipeline have an operational company in South Africa, but a holding company in a more investor-friendly jurisdiction, such as the US, UK, or France. And then something special that happens in Africa, which has 54 different countries, is that the corporate sector behaves through an oligopolistic tendency. So there are only 4 major corporate sector players that operate in the continent via subsidiaries across banking, insurance, retailers, and telcos. And it's a lot easier to scale up tech solutions in the continent versus, for example, doing so in Europe. And there's where Plug and Play plugs in and plays, because how we add value to the ecosystem is by connecting startups to our corporate partners. So basically to the private sector, to which we provide open innovation services. And that's how we can really help scale companies, as we have the connections with the institutions, because ultimately they control data and distribution, which is the most important thing when you want to scale a startup. So I'm explaining all of this because from my point of view, in South Africa, institutions still need to change a little bit their mindset, and they are working towards it, but there's still a need to really understand how important it is to actually cooperate and work with startups to bring in innovation, which is a system that is proven to work in other regions. And we, as Plug and Play we've proved it. So having said that, I would say that the biggest challenge I see in South Africa is with the National Treasury, because they are not creating incentives for people to invest in high growth, high risk startups, and they are creating barriers such as exchange control, so that South Africans are having to take out their intellectual property elsewhere to scale their businesses, to enable international investors to invest in them. And in my point of view, those are very archaic measures and they are not very progressive. And they pose a big challenge for foreign investors and for startups wanting to expand, seeking for these global investors to be part of their cap table, as they need to register their business in startup-friendly jurisdiction countries outside their home country, which is South Africa. And then lastly, I believe that there needs to be some more realism from founders and investors about valuation expectations, which have been a bit inflated, as 2021 and 2022 were outlier years in the market and should not be the benchmark. And there is capital available for high quality companies at valuations which compensate the higher risk and longer path to scale and exit, which is the reality of markets outside Europe and the US. So thank you, Adrian. These are my points on this question.
Thank you, Blanca, and very telling, because at the end of the day, as you say, you can have all the regulatory incentives, etc., but if the economics of a transaction don't make sense, they just don't make sense with valuations and so on, and ultimately needs to be underpinned by innovative IP that you believe in. Appreciate that. Thank you. Stefan, question for you. So one of the big issues reported by foreign nationals is a lack of clarity and transparency with various regulations in South Africa. Now, this is a wall that we bang our heads against regularly. But one idea was to create to improve our professional image for foreign nationals, so incoming companies and investors, and even businesses, something like an investment help desk. What does that really look like in real life?
Yeah, I think, the first question is, we don't understand it. How are we going to tell other people, how to make sense of it? So I think, and I think is a big part of what we're trying to do with the Startup Act, is really to try and create conformity in terms of, what is the playing ground that we're trying to play on? What are the rules that are relevant here? Because we cannot go and tell the world that we're open for business, but in effect, what it really means, we don't understand. So the experiences, as recounted in the case studies as well, just basically talk to foreigners arriving here, seeing the opportunity, both from an investment point of view, but also from a market uptake point of view. The report is very clear that people appreciate the business context, they appreciate the way we do business, they appreciate the ease of conducting business in South Africa, until they have to engage with government. And I don't think that is necessarily a different experience that most South African entrepreneurs would have. So the question would be to, how to address that. Now, some of the experiences of the foreigners are that when they go to other markets, firstly, from a European Union point of view, there's a lot of effort in terms of their startup initiative to try and create uniform regulations, to create uniform conditions, so that any startup wanting to go anywhere is very clear in terms of what is expected and what the rules of engagement are. So when they come to South Africa, they expect the same, and we don't have that. So one single voice or one single point of entry. You see that in Brazil, you see that in Startup India. Startup India has created a number of bridge programs where, with specific markets, they have gone and created relationships so that it's clear from a founder's point of view who you have to engage with. So the clarity that we're trying to bring with this initiative is really to take that also to a foreign startup and a foreign founder. I think maybe that's not the first point to start off with, because we first have to really ensure that from ourselves that, it's a target that is attainable. So I mean, the one example there that was given was a piece of legislation that, or a statutory body that an entrepreneur had to engage with, that would not have been flagged on any startup's radar because it's so far out of the norm, but yet that took them 2 years to get an approval. So in that instance, what do they do? Who do they phone? Who do they engage with? And that's the intention here. But like I say, I think the point is first that we've got to create that for ourselves so that we have that ability to really leverage that kind of insight. And one of the comments that was made there in the chat box is absolutely correct. It is not something that can be done from a regulatory point of view. It needs to be done from an investor or from a founder's point of view, for somebody that understands the expediency and the need for really getting quick market access when you're a startup. Just to point people in one direction only to get there again from another direction. From a foreign point of view, it is actually quite easy to do business in South Africa as a foreigner. So their patience runs out because they're in a competitive situation. So it's not a question that they can't do business, but from a South African point of view, we want them to bring their business to South Africa because then we benefit. But because we take so long and we don't have our ducks in a row, we don't get that kind of benefit. And that's what the intention would be with a help desk or a support desk or a single point of access that has been proven all over the world. It's not a uniquely South African thing.
Okay, good. Thank you. Appreciate that. And it just occurs to me immediately that South Africans are known globally for sort of being go-getters and action people, and this I suppose counterbalances the regulatory situation, which is slow and static. So an office that one could go to as an investor or incoming business that could just give you all that guidance and remove the lack of clarity would no doubt be hopefully quite helpful for that. Okay, next question is for Brian and Blanca, if either or both of you would like to respond. Another analogy here, South Africa has got a larger GDP than Finland, but Finland is one of the world's largest innovative economies and blessed with available capital markets. Can we use our own capital markets to give ourselves a competitive advantage over the rest of the world?
Okay, Bianca, do you want to go first, or can?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I believe that I'm not on mute, right? Okay. So I believe that for most people are more familiar with public markets than private markets for obvious reasons. But activity in the private markets plays an important role in helping companies receive funding and trail a path to exit. So for many years, in my point of view, people looked at South Africa from a private equity mindset. South Africa has never had, in a couple of decades, a clear understanding of the concept of feasible and sustainable innovation. South Africa wealth has been linked to primary resources being minerals, mining, agriculture, and primary sources of growth. And the mindset has always been, well, if it works in the primary sector, then we can use the same concepts of private equity in the secondary sector, which is manufacturing, and then in the tertiary sector, which is services. But when approaching tech startups, you need a different mindset. We need to embrace and understand a growth mindset, the fact that you can grow a company not based around a hard asset, and that sometimes you need to spend money to create money. And that mindset didn't exist in South Africa for many years because concepts of mobile payments and peer-to-peer exchange of assets, or concepts like online education or shared economy didn't really make sense. And the big shift we saw was around 2011, 2012, when the decentralization of assets globally started to have its impact. By that is that even though platforms like Airbnb, Uber, and online education platforms like Coursera have been around for more than 15 years, more or less, the true entry into the continent only happened about 6 to 7 years ago. And these are multi-billion-dollar companies that are less than 10 years old. So people had to see to believe that you can create significant value through asset-light industries that don't follow the economic laws of normal companies. And technological companies do not function like normal companies in many ways. So basically saying this, like if you look at Dow Jones and top 50 companies of the S&P today versus as little as 15 years ago, there's almost no overlap. But when you could see this happening in South Africa, it was an eye-opening moment for a lot of VCs, many of whose fund managers and GPs have lived abroad. So these people have seen and understood how ecosystems have flourished and have grown relatively quickly and are now applying that mindset to South Africa. And this is really what we need to see as well during the next 20 years, to see venture capital as a valuable asset class, so that every asset manager looks at this as an alternative asset and wants to be in the space. And this is already a little bit turning from what we see in the market, in my point of view. But now passing it on to Brian to see her views on this topic.
Thank you, Bianca. Just, I think I align with your sentiments, and picking up from your last statement, I agree. We need to enhance the value proposition of the venture capital kind of space, so that we develop it in a way that will increase the investment. Will increase the flow to startups through that particular space. But having said that, and just putting on a market development hat, I think there is also an opportunity for us to innovate and probably come up with new structures that maybe address risk return profiles of investors, or that just meet specific requirements for investors who can then feel more comfortable to invest in the startups through those structures. So just for example, and these are basically not very new structures, you could have the startup funds or the guarantee schemes. Of course, the startup funds will be specialized funds, and they would provide funds that are appropriate. So basically, relatively more patient capital that is needed. The guarantee schemes, they basically recalibrate the risk profiles for startups, and these would enhance the investment propositions for both domestic and even some certain categories of international investors. So that is one type of structure. The other one, and relatively innovative or new kind of structure, is a listed SME fund or a similar structure. And what that is basically it's an investment trust that would raise funds from through the public markets. Like Adrian said, the South African capital markets is large. That can be utilized to raise funds for such a listed fund. But then that fund, the main purpose of that fund is to channel the proceeds to small and medium enterprises, either through direct investment strategy or a funds of funds kind of strategy. So you are seeing a combination of the fundraising process through the public markets, as well as the rigor of the investment process for the private capital markets. And then just finally, and I think maybe Bianca touched on it briefly, if I got it correct, but you can leverage these alternative fundraising kind of approaches, crowdfunding, where we crowdsource capital. But of course, we need to build that industry, build that ecosystem to ensure we have regulated and compliant kind of platforms that will then serve that purpose. And I think a good example is the Nigerian Startup Act, which actually points this out as a potential fundraising kind of approach for startups. Thank you, Adrian. I'll stop there.
Thank you both, Brian and Blanca. That's fascinating. I mean, starting off with the principle being that we've got to create a mindset to invest specifically in startups, which is unique, and it's a completely different mindset to asset managers who just invest in the JSE. You know, it's a completely different perspective. So that mindset can be driven, as I hear it, driven with by investment frameworks. You know, protect the downside risk for these investors coming in. Give them tax incentives, give them structures like a listed fund. You mentioned that that's an excellent idea. A listed fund that gathers market capital from the investors across the market and deploys that to these small businesses. It just feels like that sort of structure would create the momentum to create a mindset for investing into startups, which, you know, always feels like the startups are very much the little brothers of the potential investment community based on the alternatives, which is a conventional investment model by most asset managers in South Africa. On that very point, Matsi, a question to you. So one of our suggestions in the Startup Act Movement's I suppose portfolio is a special tax dispensation for qualifying startups so as to increase availability of financial capital. This has been tremendously successful in various countries. The UK comes to mind immediately. But the government says, oh, we're going to lose all our tax revenue. What can we do to reassure the government that will be compensated for, or that we can reduce the abuse of this sort of incentivization?
I think many people are familiar with Section 12J, right, which was the tax incentive to encourage people to invest more in early stage startups. And as we know, in 2021, the government decided not to continue it. And in essence, we have a lot of examples of how people were able to get early stage funding from Section 12J, these venture capital companies. I think the amount of people that benefited, I suppose, was not enough to illustrate the impact of the jobs that were created. And as you mentioned, there was a lot of abuse because people, when there is an opportunity to make some money, they'll always find gaps. Our argument, however, is that we should not have cancelled Section 12J as a tax incentive to encourage people to invest in this asset class. We should rather refine it. We should rather tighten it and ensure that it does actually go towards funding these startups that we make reference to versus people's second holiday homes or safari lodges, around South Africa. So the abuse was there, it's noted. But we as an industry just believe that we should have found a way of refining it, reforming it, and also penalizing those that are abusing it. And I mean, for example, when you are a Section 18A PBO structured company, you get tax benefits for doing good, for investing in charitable deeds that are building communities. So a Section 12J is also similar type of incentive. And as a country let's not kill things that were started, because people will initially find ways of abusing, but let's refine it because, like you said, London is I think they pioneered a Section 12J type structure, which is also what we emulated ours to look like. And today it's something that has grown, right? Instead of the government killing it because perhaps there might have been some abuse, they said, how do we refine it? How do we just make sure that the crooks and those who are actually not benefiting the startup community will be penalized for it? And I think that's just what we need to do and what we will continue to lobby towards and say, it doesn't have to be Section 12J, but there has to be a form of incentive. I also sit on the board of the Technology Innovation Agency. I'm the chairperson, right? So as TIA, we are here to give support to technology and innovation companies in a form of financial and non-financial support. And I think it's important that even through structures like a TIA, we find avenues in which we can create incentives for co-investment with the venture capital industry. So, being part of TIA for over a year now, it's quite exciting to see that there is political will for things to change. And also there is, they want to integrate more with the ecosystem. It's no longer just the government carrying on and being the government. It's now, how do we actually play nice with all the other kids that are trying to build tech and innovation in South Africa?
Thank you, Matsi. I mean, to obviously police those rules are clearly a far better solution than just scrapping them. So here's hoping that we have a refined treatment of them going forward. Thank you. That's all the direct questions. There's one question in closing, which is available to all the panelists, and which is that there was an article by Annie Jaja in the TechCrunch highlighting a funding gap in South Africa. And it was to the effect that the lack of funding due to exclusion from business networks, scarcity of wealth, and asset accumulation blocks historically disadvantaged persons, most of whom are Black, from being active players in the country's digital economy. And what can we do to close the actual funding gap for these Black-owned early-stage digital startups? Any ideas from the panelists?
So I'm happy to go.
Thank you, Black.
Yeah, so given that, first of all, I am not in South Africa and I cannot never fully appreciate the issue. But from my perspective, in order to address historical economic disadvantage, it is critical to implement incentives that support capacity building and provide necessary funding for historically disadvantaged persons, which can grant them access to be players of the country's digital economy. And of course, another important point is representation, both across fund managers and success stories. Having more diverse fund managers will help entrepreneurs feel more recognized, and it can help with pushing any exiting bias. And on the other hand, exits and acquisitions of businesses started by Black funders will mean that this wealth will trickle down and play a positive role for the next generation of entrepreneurs. So thank you, Adrian. I'll stop there.
No, I do agree with Blanca. I think being inclusive is very, very important in everything that we do, from getting more Black fund managers, training them up, right? Because they never had the opportunity to be fund managers. But I think SAFCA is doing a lot of work towards ensuring that there's more Black fund managers. TIA has also invested with SAFCA around training of Black fund managers. And then also technology and the ability to grow a technology business has to be something that a young person in Soweto can identify with it. We don't need any more co-working spaces in Sandton and Bryanston, right? Really, and that is an easier thing to set up than going to a township environment and setting up co-working spaces where you find accelerators and incubators that are there presently running programs, initiatives, accelerating and incubating township-based ideas. So whenever I hear about another co-working space that's opening up in Sandton, I get quite annoyed, because they need to have more of those in township environments. I'm from the Free State, come from a place called Putarichaba and Kwakwa. There is no such thing as a co-working space or an accelerator and incubator, even in Bloemfontein, which is the biggest city, the capital of the province. So South Africa, when it deploys these interventions around getting more technology and innovation going, technology and innovation startups coming up, they have to go to township environments. Yes, security might be a challenge, but how we do not do it because security is a challenge. We obviously deploy more security. But in the absence of having enabling environments in inclusive places or places like township environments or peri-urban areas, we are not going to be able to say, here's Sipho from Soweto that came up with a world-class idea that came from Soweto, but it was, something that has a global appeal to it. So if we want transformation, if we want inclusivity, it has to be in places where we find Black talented young people who want to be fund managers, Black talented young people who want to start and create innovative ideas and get support. Because to be honest, if I'm young, I'm Black, especially I'm female, I don't have access to a lot of resources. My social capital is very limited. My ability to articulate my idea in English is probably very limited. So how do we create an environment where I have this great idea, and somebody will literally listen to me, understand me, and be able to take it from just that idea to where it should be, because the barriers to success are higher for a young Black female or a young Black male. I'm just calling it a spade, Adrian, because it is a question. That it was a very interesting article, but it talks to how are we generally trying to help technology startups from townships to actually build businesses and handhold them and expose them to networks of investors and accelerators and incubators. Yeah.
Yeah. And that must be one of the challenges the Startup Act movement addresses. It is one of the great challenges in South Africa, and it's got to be relevant to our country and continent. Thank you, Matsi. Thank you, Matsi. Thank you to the panel. I am going to open up to questions before we sort of sum up, and I have listed a few of the questions that I found on the chat box there. If you have any questions, please do bring them up in the moment. You will have seen that in the chat box there, we've also included the link to the download of the case study. So that's the detailed case study there. Just a few of the comments that came up that I can see so far. Thank you for a wonderful session, but unfortunately our legislation and its red tape is hindering growth or partnership, and that's I think that's exactly, Matsi, why we're here today. I'm not sure if that's a question or a statement we want to just confirm that we agree in. But so, yeah, so if we can create a framework for assisting entrepreneurs on a much more simple basis, then that'd be wonderful. See some questions coming through. Thank you. Another question is, oh, there was one directed to Sabiri. He has replied to that already. Thank you. He had to go slightly earlier. There's a question of how to join the movement. The movement is extremely active on LinkedIn and various social media, and it has its own website as well. So it's extremely easy to join the movement. I'll just read another comment that's this most recently included. How do we address the access to capital challenges that previously historically disadvantaged South Africans face? We have a lot of enterprise development programs, but very little rands ultimately invested in these startups at early stages. I think, Matsi, that was pretty much your point around our approach and philosophy.
Yeah, but I think the enterprise development is also quite specific, because we really created an ecosystem that supports us as ecosystem players and not the entrepreneurs. A lot of money goes towards giving us salaries. Well, I'm not really including myself, because the work that I do pro bono in the ecosystem. But, you know, there are people that are running accelerators and incubators. And if you look at the 80-20 rule, 80% goes to creating and establishing an accelerator, and then the 20% goes to funding and actually incubating and accelerating. So we really have to be very critical around that and call it out, because at the end of the day, the money that is being invested into enterprise and supply development is not going into the suppliers or the enterprises. And we really must, there was talk that it has to now be regulated in terms of the quality of accelerators and incubators that are coming out of South Africa, because the reality is we need to have more startups creating successful businesses that will contribute towards tax and that will contribute towards job creation. But the amount of money that's being spent on an annual basis due to these enterprise and development budgets that we find are not churning out the results that are intended to, which is growing our economy through growing enterprises and supporting suppliers. So there is a big gap. And as the enterprises and the suppliers, you have to question these things. You have to call people out and organizations out around. They pride themselves in enterprise and supply development. How? What is the impact to date? What is the demographic of the impact to date? And how much of the money has actually gone towards that? So we really must be more vigilant around what is really happening around money that is supposed to help small businesses in South Africa.
Brian, I think you came. Did you have a response to that, Brian? Just to make sure I didn't miss out and give you an opportunity.
Yeah, just another quick perspective, and I think it just ties to the points that we've made at various instances. But if we can find ways of increasing the domestic institutional capital into this kind of space, I think that in itself would probably ensure that we have some increased financing for startups. And the reason I say that is if you have your domestic institutional investors investing more, they're coming from a perspective of understanding the dynamics better, the nuances and all that. So they'll appreciate those kind of ideas that are more local, that are more from the townships. I don't know if that is correct reference based on what Matthew was describing. But yeah, if you have that kind of financing coming in or increasingly coming in, then you would have that flowing more into the startup space. And just as an example, for the South Africa Pension Fund, which is the largest in Africa and the largest institutional investor in South Africa, you only have about 0.3% invested in private equity as an asset class collectively. And when you talk about that, so imagine if you can increase that even to just 5%, the amount of capital that will be available to the private equity space, but of course, carving out the venture capital space and the startup space. So that is also another window that can be explored to enhance the capital that flows into that space.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Matsi. I think it's terribly exciting to see what could happen if we could unlock that capital. Oh, one last question I see. I think we've got time for one last question. Will the Act prescribe frameworks around issues such as standardizing term sheets for investing early stage startups? I can give some response to that, but maybe Matsi, you can give a first response there.
Great. So, there's a lot that's happening in our ecosystem, and that has been something that we have been talking a lot about. And the good thing is that our Africa ecosystem is really starting to connect. So what's happening in Kenya, in Senegal, in Egypt, there's an organization called Africa Arena. They kind of do a lot of work in doing Africa-wide activations around. So that is one of the questions that did come up. And I think Africa Arena is working around standardization. They already do have, for locally in South Africa, some term sheets. I think Endeavour also worked towards that.
Yes.
So this is called the Digital Africa Collective. If you had to go there, Digital Africa or Digital Collective Africa.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so they do have some templates, and it is a mission to actually standardize the terms at some point.
But it's certainly something to look out for. And I know that yourself and Endeavour and Digital Collective Africa all participated in that. I think that's it for the questions. And I think I'd just like to say what a pleasure it's been to be involved in moderating this panel. I'm going to hand over now to Brian and then Matsi, I believe, to do closing remarks and thanks.
All right. Thank you very much, Adrian. I know Matsi will come in very shortly with a vote of thanks. So maybe I won't take, I won't speak too much on that, but just to say thank you to the panelists and the participants for joining. Hopefully you found the discussions insightful. From our end, we look forward to robust policy engagements on the basis of both the startup position paper as well as this case study report. But more importantly, we look forward to the outcomes in the form of policy reforms that will then support the development of the startup ecosystem in South Africa and facilitate an increase in investments into that space. These are the kind of reforms that are envisaged as part of the broader market system changes and our Africa Private Capital Markets program that I mentioned when we were starting. And of course, alongside other kind of impacts, we want to see more knowledge, more capacity in the space, and increased financing, which is a point I've made severally, to fund the continent's development and economic priorities, of course, through our enterprises. So thank you once again, and we look forward to subsequent engagements. Over to you, Matsi.
Thank you so much, Brian. It wouldn't be possible without you and the assistance of FSD Africa. So we are really, really fortunate. We are very grateful that you are able to come on board and to fund this particular study and to show your commitment to how do you enable an ecosystem that you're trying to invest in. So to FSD Africa, Brian and his team, we want to just thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for joining. Thank you to the startups, the technology startups that want to change South Africa and contribute towards our economy. Thank you to Stefan Lambrecht, who was the man responsible for going in and getting all the commentary, getting all the inputs, putting it together. A lot of chasing had to happen. And then also I want to thank you, Adrian, for your wonderful moderation, and also the Extended Startup Act Movement Steering Committee for their dedication to ensuring that we are a collective. The voice of the ecosystem is represented, and we're speaking as a voice as we engage the government. And then last but not least, thank you to Kingsley and the Simodisa team for putting this together. I know I don't say this a lot, but we do appreciate all the work and the effort that you put into this. And on that note, thank you, everybody, and we will be in touch. And also, just how do you get access to a copy of this this research report that we were speaking about today? Is we encourage you to go to startupact.co.za. And in essence, I think, Kingsley, if you could just put the QR code, you would be able to then download the report that speaks to real people with real experiences. So go to startupact.co.za. You'll be able to either join the movement or and download the report. So thanking you all, and we're going to be in touch, and keep well and be safe. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.